but let's stay on time. I'm sure people will come back. I wanted to, well, thank you, Lon, for facilitating that first panel, and I'm going to do the second, but I don't think it will need a heavy hand. I just want to really introduce it. The prior panel introduced the conversation around a number of pillars for moving forward on climate action, and those pillars were investments, disclosure, policy advocacy, and engagement. And we had 2 outside speakers. Here, realizing that we have also internal expertise, we have 2 folks joining us, one from the pension boards and one from the UCF, along with someone from ICCR who I'd like to introduce now. So, Stephanie, welcome. So glad to have you from ICCR. We had our choice of Josh, who is the CEO, or somebody like Tim Smith, who is a veteran of the engagement wars, but it was recommended, Stephanie, that we invite you, and we're so glad you could come here. Stephanie works in the same building, although she has not been in the building at the same time with us. She's at 475 Riverside. And she is a program director on the ICCR's Climate and Environmental Justice Initiative, focuses on methane and just transition, and has a pretty good career before that, including a stint as a manager at the Carbon Disclosure Project, where she worked with investors and financial services companies to integrate corporate environmental disclosure data into financial products. She's actually at Bard now, I guess, also getting an advanced degree in sustainability. So we're very pleased to have you. And joining Stephanie on this panel is Rick Walters. Everyone knows Rick, but Counsel and Director of Corporate Social Responsibility for the pension boards. You all know that Rick is an MDiv and an ordained minister and a lawyer as well. Does direct proxy voting and shareholder advocacy. Works with the investment team here at the pension boards in keeping with our faith and finance initiatives. And then thirdly, Matthew Illian was going to open us up. But Matthew is maybe perhaps new to some of you, but Matthew is UCF's Director of Responsible Investing. A lot of experience working with philanthropic organizations and other value-based investors in designing investment strategies. And Matthew is on the board of the Virginia Impact Investing Forum. Those of you at the UCF are no strangers to Matthew, but I want to welcome the 3 of you. But really the topic here, and you'll make some opening remarks, is the ways in which engagement has evolved. It has become an effective tool. You heard Jim Antle say that and admit that. It's a bit surprising after what happened in 2013, but it has been very effective. And you're going to, together with 3 of you, speak about the cutting edge of engagement and get us excited about what's going on and why this should be a pillar of our efforts going forward in terms of a plan. So Matthew, let me turn it over to you.
Thank you, Dave. And yeah, just passed my 1-year anniversary, but it's all been during COVID. So yeah, virtual for the duration, but so the pension board folks, it's great to see you all even in this format. We're going to talk about I'm going to share about climate lobbying, and before I do that, because sometimes this feels like it's hard to kind of make it really tangible and practical, even though Kirsten Spalding did remind us that climate risk is systemic risk, it's business risk. I'm going to start with an analogy that hits a little closer home for me. I'm the father of 4 kids, three boys and a girl, and I'm going to argue that video games are also systemic risk. And often the way it goes in our house is we'll say, okay, guys, it's time to stop playing the game. And usually they say, okay, they're respectful for the most part, but then they say, can we just finish the game? And it's like, God, as a parent, it's like you could be agreeing to another hour. You don't know what you're getting into, and you don't want to do that. So it's and we'll say, go, it's time to clean your room or something, and you'll see them kind of slowly make the transition. And that's a little bit what this lobbying work is about. we're kind of telling, these businesses, corporations have made these commitments, and now we're saying it's time to start taking action. And a friend of mine who's also a father of kids said, my kids, they've patented the slow roll, which is you take a step just slow enough where the parents can't say, you're not moving, you're not doing anything, but it doesn't look like you're taking the most direct step sometimes. So lobbying is all about how corporations are spending their dollars to influence policy, and it's about the associations that they're members of. And what we find in this work is that a lot of companies are still part of membership associations that continue to finance and support, business as usual, the fossil fuel industry, pro fossil fuel industry policy, and so the lobbying piece is really calling that to account and asking these corporations to assess who their memberships are, what they're part of, Chamber of Commerce and others, and then what their policies, the commitments that they have made. So there are 3 champions that we want to highlight that are organizing collective efforts around this work. It can't happen alone. It's been talked about a lot, that this is really a collaborative effort. I'm going to share about ICCR because first, that's the organization that we're a founding member of and are part of a climate lobbying advocacy effort. Climate Action 100 has been mentioned. They have benchmarks now in every single company, and they will rate those companies red, yellow, green on every area, including their lobbying, on alignment with Paris climate 1.5 degree Paris policy. And they've identified, it started out with the 100 most critical emitters, and it's now grown. So that's why they have the plus. It's the 100 plus companies that they are targeting. And we're also involved with that. And then you just heard from Kirsten Spalding, and Ceres is a leading champion in all of this environmental finance work. So with that, if Samantha, we go to the next slide. With ICCR, we focused on 25 companies that were sent letters saying that we want to start engagements and be in dialogue with you on your climate lobbying policies. And of those 25, we ended up filing shareholder resolutions at 7 companies. And I'm happy to report that of the 5, we were able to, our partners were able to withdraw their resolutions because they saw the company making a significant commitment to say, hey, we're going to start reporting on how these membership associations align with our climate policies. 2 of them didn't agree, and Sempra Energy and Norfolk Southern, I'm going to kind of talk about last. But what you'll see is these are the 6 shareholder resolutions that went to a vote. So that's those who were part of the ICCR effort, the series, and other efforts. 6 resolutions went to a vote asking companies to create a report on how their climate lobbying it was in line with their commitments to support Paris. And you can see the investor response. I mean, it was majority votes at every single one of them. And at companies that were, on Delta, I mean, these are all, fossil fuel policy is critical to their business risk. And so you can see that investors are now saying it's time to look at how your lobbying dollars are spent. And so with Norfolk Southern, that was led by our colleagues at Friends Fiduciary. That's a Quaker organization. And we partnered with them to file this resolution. And when we met with them, it was really a learning experience for us. We learned about what membership associations they were part of. And you can see the three that they supported are listed here: American Power, Association of American Railroads, and the National Association of Manufacturers. And once we dug into each of those, we found that all three had troubling policies in supporting the fossil fuel industry, and in terms of how their lobbying dollars were spent. And so when we brought this up with Norfolk Southern, their response was that, you know, they're a carrier of coal, so they can't fight that entirely, but that that there were efforts underway to look at it, and frankly we felt like those efforts weren't robust enough. And so we filed the resolution asking for this report, and 76% of shareholders agreed. Now, the backstory to that 76% is that we also sent letters to the largest asset owners in the world. So there's a Vanguard, BlackRock, State Street, and we laid out the whole story of why we felt like Norfolk Southern really needs to pay closer attention to this. And we would not have gotten to 76% support or 60+ majority support at any of these resolutions had those large asset owners not supported these. And so engagement is important as collaborations, but what we're seeing now is that we're starting to see the largest asset owners are becoming part of these engagement efforts. There's more dialogue happening between the ICCR members, the series members, and these large asset owners than ever before. And that's why we're starting to see this success. So I know that Stephanie also has some important, and Rick as well, examples. So Dave, I'll pass it back to you, or do you want to pass it right on to Stephanie?
Right on to Stephanie.
Thank you, Dave. Thank you, Matthew. This is an honor to be part of this panel representing ICCR. As Dave said before, my name is Stephanie Lavallato. I'm an Associate Program Director for our climate and environmental justice work at ICCR. And before we dive into the topic that I'll be discussing today, which is our kind of engagement approaches around a just transition, for those that are not as familiar with ICCR, I thought I'd give a brief background. So next slide, please. ICCR is a nonprofit coalition of faith and values-based investors, foundations, nonprofits, and other shareholder advocates who are seeking to use their investments to catalyze change on environmental and social issues. As Matthew mentioned, UCF and the Pension Board are both founding members of ICCR, so we're very proud to have you still as part of this coalition today, and thank you for your continued support. But back in 1971, we were founded and ultimately kind of pioneered the shareholder advocacy movement when our members pressured companies to withdraw their businesses from apartheid South Africa. And we've grown quite a bit since, and now have over 300 members representing over $4 trillion in assets under management. Next slide, please. And so engagement is really at the heart of what we do at ICCR, and engagements include everything from corporate dialogues and resolutions, as Matthew just described, to organizing investor sign-ons. You heard a little bit about that from Kirsten, as well as coordinating multi-stakeholder engagements like roundtables and other convenings. And so here on this slide, you can see some of the principles that inform ICCR's engagement efforts, which I'll give you a moment to quickly review. Everything from a focus on systemic risks to incorporating all stakeholders as part of a vision for long-term value. And so these principles are a core foundation of our just transition work, which on the next slide, I'll briefly introduce. Just transition is one of four of ICCR's climate program areas. However, we do think just transition is ultimately a lens that you can look at any sector through, any issue through. And to kind of ground us in the same understanding of just transition, one definition of it that we refer to often is from a report that came out last year. In bold here, you can see a just transition integrates the concerns of workers and communities into climate-related planning and activity. It's a slightly overly simplified view of just transition, but it includes kind of the three main components of climate transition, workers and communities, and all those factors being considered in a transition plan. And so you can apply this lens to any of the sectors that are undergoing major transitions, particularly in this decade. But ICCR is currently focused on the energy utility sector in our work. Next slide, please. For a few key reasons. So utilities are inherently place-based. They service geographic regions, and their plant closures and new infrastructure developments are going to have direct impacts on communities, workers, and ratepayers. But because the sector is so closely controlled by public policy, particularly at a state level, it further enhances that place-based perspective. The sector is also heavily unionized, so there's a great opportunity to ensure that the union jobs are maintained as we transition to a renewable energy economy. And lastly, the sector has great potential to decarbonize. The utility sector represents nearly 1/3 of US emissions today, and by decarbonizing this sector, it unlocks potential to decarbonize other sectors that are heavily dependent on electricity, such as transport, heating, and manufacturing. And so ultimately, the utility sector is a convergence of these critical environmental, social, and economic issues, as well as a convergence of multiple stakeholders. And so this highlights a great opportunity to not only work towards a just transition, but also the importance of multi-stakeholder engagements, which brings us to kind of the three prongs of engagements that have so far encompassed our just transition work. Place-based engagements include, working with stakeholders on the ground in communities such as labor, environmental justice, and other community groups to understand their needs and the opportunities that they see as utilities undergo their transition plans. Policy engagements with investors to advocate for just and equitable decarbonization legislation at a state level, again, given the regulated nature of the sector. And lastly, bringing elements of the policy and the place-based multi-stakeholder dialogues and conversations into corporate engagements with utilities when it's appropriate. And so we've had a chance to experiment with what this looks like in practice over the last few years in New England. Next slide, please, where kind of organically, we've developed relationships that are deep, meaningful, authentic relationships with environmental justice groups in Massachusetts that have kind of been our keystone connection to be able to leverage what's going on the ground in our corporate engagements with the utility sector in this region. A group called Gas Leaks Allies up in Massachusetts is a coalition of community and environmental groups focused on gas issues, but they also have great connections to the labor community. And so through these relationships, we've been able to engage and include a variety of stakeholders in our engagements. For example, we organized a roundtable back at the end of 2019 to inform investor expectations on utilities in a just transition. And this involved multiple meetings with labor groups and environmental justice groups ahead of the roundtable to ensure that their ideas and concerns and contributions were communicated effectively to both investors and utilities, and bringing all those stakeholders to the same table for discussion. On the policy side, several ICCR members with investments in the Massachusetts utility industry signed a letter advocating for strong climate policy in Massachusetts, and that was ultimately followed by a bill passing and being signed into law by Governor Baker back in March that set the Commonwealth up for a decarbonization by 2050 commitment. And these stakeholder and policy engagements are now culminating in an ongoing engagement with Eversource Energy. We've had a few engagements so far, and we have one more engagement call coming up this fall. And we've worked with these groups on the ground, again, the labor and environmental justice groups, by including them in prep calls with the investor team, leading the Eversource engagement to really bring new light to some of the questions that we had planned to ask, and making sure that the voices of those stakeholders on the ground are being reciprocated in the boardroom. And one of the biggest measures of success that we've seen from this work so far is that we got approval from Eversource to bring in one of the representatives from Gas Leaks Allies into our next dialogue call with them. So having one of the most impacted stakeholders from the community in the room with us is one huge marker of success that we see. And I'll close by sharing that this work in Massachusetts has served as kind of a potential model, potential pilot, as we've been calling it, for other regions. And ICCR does plan to expand this approach, really focus on the place-based lens in the Northeast, the Upper Midwest, and Southeastern regions as we expand our team and build this work out over the next 18 months. So I pass it over to Rick, I guess, and look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Stephanie and Matthew. I think that really collaboration is so key to this work that we're doing. And Matthew and I began to work together this year where we co-filed with him on an engagement that he was leading with Gilead. And we hope to do more collaborative projects together as we move along in the future. We have two active engagements with fossil fuel companies. One is with Noble Energy. And that's a very interesting engagement because it centers around offshore drilling and refining that they're doing off the coast of Israel, Palestine. And so it offered a unique opportunity to address multiple issues with the company regarding not only the environmental impact of their activities, but also the impact on the conflict between Israel and Palestine, which was, as UCCers know, we just had a recent resolution passed at General Synod concerning that. But I wanted to focus on the practical aspects of doing an engagement and use the example of an engagement that I've been involved with now for 8 years with the ConocoPhillips company. The slide has a fancy title, Elements of a Systemic Strategy, but I think a more informal title would be What Happens in the Room Where It Happens, for those of you who are Hamilton fans. What happens in that room when we get together with the management of a company, some of their sustainability folks, and often the CEO participates directly into these engagements. So this is sort of an anatomy of a successful engagement that we had with ConocoPhillips, and the elements of that that maybe will give you a little flavor or a taste of what actually happens in that room. So when you go into an engagement, of course, there's a lot of preparation that you need to do, but there are also some steps that you want to come out with. The first thing is you need adequate data to confront the company about whatever issue it is that you're dealing with. In this case, it was a 10.5 million acre concession to explore for oil and gas in the Amazon basin. So this was going to have a tremendous impact not only on the environment, but on the world in terms of potentially destroying parts of the Amazon. But we had a good data study that was done by a very reputable activist organization, Amazon Watch. And they had documented and detailed just what kind of environmental impact the exploration of fossil fuel in the Amazon would create. And they unfortunately had a bad example of a previous exploration that had been done by Chevron that left many indigenous communities in a real dire situation. So you have to have good data. One of the things that happens in engagements is that when you go in the room and you start talking, the people from the company are going to try and bamboozle you. They're going to try and throw out facts and information and in essence to tell you, you don't know what you're talking about. So you need to be well prepared that way. You need a good standard to hold the company to. And so we often look for an internationally recognized standard that the company can look to see what they should be aspiring to achieve. And in this particular case, we had a couple of good standards. The Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, because there was going to be direct impact on potentially 700 tribes in the Amazon. That's a lot of people. And also there was a UN standard on informed consent by indigenous peoples about resources in the areas where they live. The third thing you need is a good ask. So just as Matthew was saying, We want disclosure about lobbying and political spending from the company so that we can tell if you're aligned with Paris in terms of how you're spending that money and how you're influencing policy. And in this case, our specific ask was around the impact that they were going to have on the environment, the indigenous peoples, and what that was going to do in terms of the company's reputation and their financial viability. And this is called making the business case. So we're making a moral case, a moral and ethical case that the company needs to change behaviors. But we're also saying, you know, and it'll also be bad for business. You'll probably lose money, and you'll probably have a hit to the value of your stock. So those kind of things interplay with one another, and you have to make both sides of that argument. Implementation is difficult for companies, and we've talked several times throughout this symposium about how you can set goals, but unless you take specific actions to achieve the goals, then it's really sort of an empty process. So incorporating business practices that make managers accountable. So a question that I always ask in an engagement is concerning whatever it is that we're asking for the company to do. I'm asking them, how are you going to make, or how do you make your operational managers responsible for environmental goals, for the achievement of those goals? Is it built into their remuneration incentives? Is it built into their performance review processes? So that if the managers are not performing the actions that are necessary to implement the policies, that there's some accountability all the way down to the operational level. And then finally, you don't just accept the word of the company that, oh yeah, we're going to take care of this, we're going to do this, that, and the other. You want to verify. You want them to adopt policies, you want them to measure results, and you want them to report back to shareholders. And one of the things that was great about the success of the ConocoPhillips engagement was that the company actually adopted the UN standards into their company policy, so that if they were violating the UN standards, they were also violating their own internal policies. And that was really a very powerful move, and why ConocoPhillips responds in a way that it has a little bit higher quality than many other companies. We don't want to, forget about the importance of reporting to shareholders, being accountable to shareholders, because most shareholders are just asking a company to be accountable about value, about price, about returns. But we're in a unique position as a faith-based, value-based shareholder activist to be asking for them to be accountable in a moral and ethical way. And so you just cannot underestimate the power of that and the importance of that. I call it going to Zacchaeus. When Jesus asked Zacchaeus to come down out of the tree, and he says, I'm going to your house to talk about your situation. That's what engagement is. Engagement is about going into their house and calling them to question about their policies and their ethics. So I hope that kind of gives you a feel for how things happen in the room. And I'd be glad to, I think, along with the other panelists, to hear questions from you or concerns or ideas. And also, I like to affirm, some of the things that they've already talked about too.
Rick, maybe while we're waiting, or questions, or I'm not sure, Dave, if you want to wait for the breakouts, but if you could just talk to, you talked about the business, taking the business case. How have you seen that evolve in the faith community and the ICCR crowd over time? Because my sense is, and I'm newer to this, is that that's very clear, you know, now that's a priority in these engagements. Have you seen that shift over time, or is it kind of always been there?
I've really seen a big shift in that because of the importance of reputational risk. We used to call that enlightened self-interest, that a company would have enlightened self-interest. Now we call it reputational risk. So you will see that in a world of social media and advertising and news investigative reporting, that companies do not want to be tainted by information that comes out about bad behavior. And so that has driven the argument by those who engage with moral and ethical arguments to make the business case that if you're not behaving rightly, your company's going to take a reputational hit, and that could affect consumer sales. That could affect your ability to merge and acquire. That can affect the value of your stock price. So that difference in the public image of companies, and you see companies responding to political issues and political candidates saying, we don't want to be associated with you because the risk of being associated with you is going to turn off young consumers, people who have differing political views, etc. So that really has evolved, and it's easier and more beneficial for us when we're making a business case.
I have a maybe hopefully thought-provoking question. I see a lot of people shaking their heads, and there's a link to the activism of the church and the issues which is being raised by the folks who are involved with engagement. But I was struck by two things. One, Stephanie, the idea of community engagement and gathering up those in the community being effective seems really aligned with the ways in which the UCC might view the world, right? Community engagement. And then juxtaposed against that, not to try to make this too complicated a question, you have this influence of these really large investors sitting out there, right? Who are now swaying votes, hopefully in ways that values-based investors will really be aligned with. But maybe the panel can address the tension between the effectiveness of things happening at the community level and the power of these really large investors. And is there enough room for us, you know, to get involved?
I can start and share my thoughts on this one. What you kind of described, I view as almost a bottom-up and a top-down approach. Both are very effective in different ways, and they're not mutually exclusive. But I think as Matthew kind of articulated before in the example, the influence of the big asset managers to get some of these shareholder wins are going to be really critical on some of these high-emitting sectors and companies that we're targeting. But as following the last question / topic of discussion on the kind of evolution of the business case for what has been the moral case for a long time, there's this obvious risk of greenwashing, as we call it, or being all talk and not walking the walk, not actually making changes to your internal policies to have these requests be embedded throughout the business. And that's where I see the value of one of the many values of engaging communities is to help raise some of the red flags of how these companies are or are not implementing certain actions, or getting that firsthand view to be more prepared for those behind closed doors conversations with companies, to have intel that you might not get from their own disclosures that the BlackRocks and the Vanguards of the world might help push forward. But it's kind of the goalpost is always going to be moving, and I think the community level approach and intel and information helps articulate where that goalpost needs to be.
Yeah, I think particularly in the area of climate, those who are making the moral argument that we need to do something about climate change, the big asset managers are finding that to be very compelling. Basically, we're making an argument, we're bringing a perspective out of our value-based approach, and then we're asking these asset managers to join with us because it's not only the right thing to do, but it also will protect the value of their investments. That's the business side of that argument. And as Matthew talked about, the 7 companies with the 5 majority votes, ICCR based resolutions this year had 20 majority votes. That's extraordinary. That's just unbelievable. And that's in part due to the joining and partnership collaboration of large asset managers. But I think it's mostly because the argument is compelling.
I see a hand up and also 2 quick questions about ConocoPhillips. Maybe Rick, briefly, the 2 in the chat. Has ConocoPhillips evolved beyond the Amazon? In other words, the evidence of change at Conoco as a result of the intervention into other businesses. And then Leslie asks, okay, so how do you pick ConocoPhillips? And does it have to be one, or is it really sort of, is the new state really that there's a collaborative effort so you can have more impact across a number of companies and across a company in many dimensions? And then over to you, Bob, after that.
Yeah, well, the first thing is that Conoco gave up its concession in the Amazon. They walked away from it, which was a tremendous victory. But they've also taken now that that's incorporated into their company policy, and they've expanded on that. So they also operate in Western Canada and Alaska, and they've implemented the same kinds of policies with respect to Indigenous peoples in those areas. So we continue to meet with them 2 to 3 times a year to get updates on, and they have developed a sort of model program on how companies interact with Native populations. And that has been filtering now into their inclusion, diversity, and equity programs in terms of sensitizing employees, because they have to train their employees to observe these policies toward First Nation people and Native American people and so forth. So they have continued to grow and expand in that particular program. Now, they still produce fossil fuel products, which is not good, but they are providing a model in terms of this interaction with Indigenous peoples.
To Matthew, really quickly, so you've been here for a year. How do you determine the engagements that you select kind of early on in the process?
Well, a big part of that was inheriting the work that Katie McCloskey led, and just continuing to lean into that work. And then I think it's a discernment process with our SRI committee, and also internally with staff. I think we're also trying to be responsive to where we see the church headed, and so I think. And I heard it mentioned from the PB side on having a session on this on DEI, and I think it's clear that we need to be, and we are, prioritizing the diversity, equity, inclusion in all of this engagement work, hand in hand, and there are so many rooms, and it's often it feels overwhelming sometimes to think about. How do you select and choose? But through that discernment process with committee, with staff, and listening to the church body are all pieces to that.
I would just add that hopefully this integrated approach, particularly in the future, where we are depending on our managers also to have pretty good engagement policies, and we're selecting managers because they're also doing that. But maybe, Bob, I know you've had your hand up. A question from you.
Yes, thanks, Dave. So a question for Rick and Matt. When you're specifically when you're engaging with BlackRock, do you find that you're engaging with them and they are kind of in a passive mode, or are you able to engage them in terms of joining you in your activism strategy on whatever issue that you are focused on?
I can just jump in to say, I think BlackRock has been less involved in their own direct engagements, but where we have found leverage is engaging them on their proxy voting. And so the question that we put to BlackRock and shareholder resolution put to BlackRock is essentially, are they going to align their shareholder proxy voting with their statements to support the climate, to support workers, et cetera. And that has helped move the needle for sure. I mean, we actually, in collaboration with other investors, withdrew our shareholder resolution because we saw that this past year, they had made significant commitments to update their proxy voting policies. And we see the results in how a lot of these resolutions got majority votes this past year. So we're not pulling them into engagements with us, but we are seeing influence in the way that they vote their shares.
It's actually quite interesting how we're able to influence public policy through these efforts on political spending and lobbying, because though we're a 501c3, so we can't direct lobby as a religious organization, but through the power of our shares, we're able to impact how policy is made in Washington because of the money that it's poured in to influencing Congress. And that's where aligning people, or asking them to be aligned with their public statements in the way that they spend money on trade organizations that lobby and on their own direct lobbying, that we're able to influence better policy.
Thank you.
Maybe just finally for me, and we are wrapping up, Matthew and Rick in particular, and Stephanie, you can chime in. We spent a little time before asking trustees how they could be helpful in this regard in terms of a policy. Matthew, you alluded to it, a bit in terms of your interaction with the committee so far. But what's the cutting edge ask of committees and trustees?
Well, sometimes it boils down to budget, right? And we want to continue to put our resources behind these collaborative efforts of organizations like ICCR and Ceres to do this important work. Back when I started doing this, we were really asking the question, where is ICCR and where are they going? And they were able to attract and hire a new CEO, Josh Zinner, and talented staff people like Stephanie, who have just transformed ICCR into a powerhouse of influence on corporate behavior. And so continuing to budget in resources that help us to support these organizations and their efforts, and to support the social responsibility aspect of what we do as investment firms is really important.
From you,
I can't add a lot to that. I think Rick hit it on the head. Certainly we also, we want to be responsive to people who, on our board who are pastors at churches and others in terms of what they're hearing, in their climate action committees. And so, that's the hard work often is translating. When we get a company to say they'll commit to a report in a year, that's a good result sometimes from shareholders. But if you tell an activist they're going to create a report in a year to talk about where they're at, that's not necessarily moving fast enough. So
or impact, yeah.
Yeah.
Good. Okay, well, as we said, engagement is such an important part of an ongoing strategy. So thanks so much for the window, brief window, given the time that we have into that engagement world. Thank you, Stephanie, for letting us know what's new in just transition and community engagement, which sounds really exciting. So we look forward to continue to have the UCF and the pension boards work with you and ICCR. So please give a hand to the three panelists.